China has immense influence now in Africa and Latin America, partly based on the fact that they invested very heavily through their Belt and Road Initiative at a time when the West wasn't really interested, and partly because of the admiration people have for what you call efficient authoritarianism, as opposed to very corrupt and incompetent semi-democracies, which is very often the alternative.
At some point in this century, the world's two leading economies are likely to be China and India. China, of course, is almost there, with or without the help of espionage and spying. India is the world's largest democracy, as is so often pronounced when elections are taking place, but it is a flawed democracy with a fairly authoritarian leader. China, of course, is not a democracy at all, but a nominally Marxist, totalitarian state capitalist enterprise, which makes not the slightest obeisance to Western liberal niceties. If we had become accustomed to the world being led by nice, liberal democracies, then we're in for a shock. How we cope with these changes will be crucial. This is all the subject of the latest book by one of the perhaps few eminent politicians this country has produced of late, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Vince Cable, whose new book is called Eclipsing the West. Sir Vince, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Very grateful to have you there.
No, thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure and a privilege. Looking at China, let's kick off with China. The rise of the Asian superstates has been one of the big stories of the last geopolitical stories of the last 25, 30 years. Clearly, we're having trouble coping with it, aren't we? We do not quite know in which way to tilt, as has been evidenced in the last couple of weeks with the China spy scandal, the building of their embassy and so on. What would you suggest?
Well, my first acquaintance with China was about 30 years ago. I was then in Shell, their planning team and their chief economist, and I went off to China when they were trying to make decisions on whether to invest large sums of money in China. And the way of looking at it through the company and other companies is that you have a mixture of threats and opportunities. You know, there are real threats, and secrets are stolen. You have threats to staff because they're not governed by the rule of law. But there are also big opportunities. And I think the problem with our politics is that we don't see this balancing that has to take place the whole time between security and economic opportunities. We see everything as black and white, and that's actually not very helpful.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? You go back to 88, 89 and Francis Fukuyama, and we were convinced at the time, or some people were, that the end of history was in sight, and that a kind of liberal democracy was the thing which would take us all forward, and the countries would kind of converge into a sort of liberal democracy. But the rise of the Asian superstate has rather shaken that notion. And it has proved attractive not merely within Asia itself, but also further afield, a kind of authoritarian take on democracy, which I would guess you would not feel comfortable with.
No, I mean, your starting point is that the way the world has changed. You know, we thought in the West 30 years ago, into the Cold War, that we'd won. And politically, in many ways, we had. The West offered a superior political model, but economically, what was then the West had about 60% of the world economy. It's now down to about 40%, simply because much of the rest of the world, particularly Asia, not just China and India, but Southeast Asia, have been growing much more rapidly. They still are. And they've got economic problems. China's got quite serious economic problems at the moment. But they're still, when you add it all up, more important than we are economically. And in terms of the political model, it isn't just the arguments taking place in the UK. I mean, China has immense influence now in Africa and Latin America, partly based on the fact that they invested very heavily through their Belt and Road Initiative at a time when the West wasn't really interested, and partly because of the admiration people have for what you call efficient authoritarianism, as opposed to very corrupt and incompetent semi-democracies, which is very often the alternative.
Well, that is right, isn't it? And it's also the path down which, of course, Russia has trodden. In that you might argue that Putin is another simple example of what was called Asian democracy, but what we should probably call an Asian superstate.
Well, I wouldn't put Russia in the same bracket as China or even India. I mean, they have a lot of nuclear weapons, which is alarming. I think they were once called Upper Volta with rockets, and there is an element of that. It's in some ways quite a fragile country, and that's what's alarming about it. I mean, if Putin goes down, and he could well do because of the mismanagement of this war, I mean, all kind of chaotic outcomes are possible, and that's one thing the Chinese, for example, are absolutely terrified about. So I wouldn't. Russia is a superpower because of its nuclear weapons, but not in any other sense.
But not economically.
No.
I'm interested in the rise of India. It's already overtaken China as being the most populous country in the world. Its economy is growing and growing. I can't remember the figures, but I looked them up recently. They rather dwarfed our own economy. Traditionally non-aligned, but tended to have good relations with, for example, Russia, and very bad relations with China. How do you see the rise of India, and what will happen as a consequence?
Well, your point is that they still have good relations with Russia, and they do see China as a threat. Those two things haven't changed. I mean, the one thing that has changed, and I've been going to India now for about 60 years on business, academic, political, family reasons, and I've seen this country growing. Of course, the animal spirits of Indian entrepreneurs were sort of liberated by Manmohan Singh in the early 90s when they went through the reform and opening up process that China had been through, and they got for a while to sort of double-digit growth, 9-10% economic growth. It's still 6-7%. I mean, that's far, far larger than we would ever dream of. So although India is sometimes belittled, as people have described it as sort of anarchy that works, not a kind of ideal environment to do business, but somehow it functions, and they very good at adapting, and created now a very large middle class, some brilliant entrepreneurs. And if you're looking 20 years ahead, I would encourage people to look to India, probably even more than China.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because whatever the problems with the way in which India is governed, and I would have thought that Mr. Modi is probably not your favourite foreign leader, it nonetheless is a democracy. Do we think that it will remain a democracy basically along kind of Western lines democracy? It's far more liberal democracy than, well, obviously China, obviously Russia. Do we think that democracy will endure?
Well, one of the arguments I made in this book, and it probably is a bit controversial, is that the Chinese and Indian political models aren't all that different. I mean, they are semi-democratic, and China is obviously authoritarian, but a lot of their politics is governed by the fact that they're trying to hold together countries of 1.5 roughly billion people, vast countries, 20 times as many people as us, very, very diverse, with a constant tendency to pull apart and bits to secede. And that determines, in both cases, a fairly tough approach to government. And you've now got a strong one-man leader in India. And he is a Hindu fundamentalist, and that's worrying if you're a Christian or a Muslim. But nonetheless, the system really dictates the need to have a strong leadership. And they have cracked down on dissent. But at the same time, you have to look at China also in terms of its political system. It is authoritarian, and you do have an extremely powerful party chairman. But in many ways, it's very decentralized. A lot of their decision-making is taking place at the level of local mayors. These are the people who make the decisions around building roads and railways and new housing developments. So there's a lot of power in China goes down to the grassroots, as well as being hoarded politically at the centre. So there isn't a gigantic difference between the way the two countries are actually run once you take away the labels.
It rather reminds me of what always used to be said about the Soviet Union and Russia in general, which is not a surprise at how badly Russia was run or how nastily, but a surprise that it was run at all, given its size and the number of people who lived in it.
Yeah, that's a very neat summary, I think.
Yeah. I've got to ask you this just before you go. Reform miles ahead in the polls at the moment. Should Lib Dem voters and Labour voters have some sort of alliance, along with the Greens, to stop Nigel Farage becoming the next Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think formal alliances are on, not that there's any appetite for it. And the idea of ganging up against reform, I think, would turn off the voters. We do have tactical voting. It's one of the reasons the Lib Dems did very well at the last election. But I think my own view is that we shouldn't be personally attacking Nigel Farage, accusing him of a racist or whatever. I think that's very bad politics. I think what we should be doing is setting out the areas of big differences. I mean, he was, after all, the author of Brexit, which I think 2/3, 3/4 of the public now think was not a good move. He's very close to Trump, which I think a lot of people in the UK find very off-putting. And their economics is completely off the wall, vast spending and tax cuts all at the same time. So those are the things we should be going for, rather than just ganging up on reform. That's not a good way to deal with it.
Sir Vince Cable, thanks ever so much for joining me this morning. A pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Sir Vince's book, Eclipsing the West, is available at timesbookshop.co.uk, where Times Plus members will enjoy a 20% discount on that and thousands of other titles.